The most harrowing aspects of the Second World War involved the sight of young combatants, some barely past the age of early childhood, wielding armaments like the potent Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon, the intimidating Panzerschreck rocket launcher, and the reliable MP-40 submachine gun. The situation in the final months of the conflict, particularly within German territory, reached such a level of desperation that mere children, in some cases as young as 10 years old, were thrown directly into the path of formidable Soviet T-34 tanks, devastating artillery bombardment, and the relentless onslaught of the Red Army. If you find this deep dive into the darkest history of World War II compelling, please consider hitting the like button on this video. Your support helps us uncover these essential, tragic truths. What unfolded within the beleaguered German capital of Berlin in April 1945 was a period of savage, almost unbelievable brutality, marking the swift, ignominious collapse of the promised 1,000-year Reich after a mere 12 years of existence. With the Allied forces pressing relentlessly from the west and the massive Soviet Red Army surging from the east, the Nazi regime increasingly turned to boys, many of whom had yet to become teenagers, to serve as a final, fragile shield against inevitable defeat. These young combatants were overwhelmingly drawn from the ranks of the Hitler Youth, their involvement being a clear testament to the utter extremity of the situation. This is the somber truth behind why children were mobilized as soldiers, and the tragic reason they were subsequently killed by opposing forces, including British troops. From the very moment the Nazis seized power, they embarked on a systematic campaign to immerse both boys and girls in their political doctrines and ideological beliefs. The Hitler Youth was far more than a simple after-school club, where children might gather for casual games and recreational activities. It was fundamentally a stringent, military-focused organization dedicated to the rigorous training and ideological conditioning of its members. The boys, in particular, were meticulously prepared to become loyal soldiers, ready to sacrifice their lives for the ultimate survival and glory of the Reich. They were thoroughly drilled in a variety of disturbing tenets: that warfare was a noble and heroic pursuit, that the act of self-sacrifice for the fatherland was the highest form of glory, and that to die in service of Hitler was the most honourable fate one could achieve. Beyond this martial conditioning, they were also steeped in the regime's abhorrent racial policies, being taught that the so-called Aryan people were inherently superior, and, critically, that the enemy, especially the Communists and Soviets, were barbaric, existential threats undeserving of life or mercy. By 1945, a whole generation of German youth had matured under the relentless drumbeat of Nazi schooling and fervent brainwashing. Consequently, a significant number of teenagers were staunch, genuine believers in the core ideology of the regime. While a few undoubtedly began to question their faith, these dissenters were in the minority. This entrenched ideology and profound belief system meant that the young men of Nazi Germany required little coercion to take up arms and march into combat. The year 1944 marked a disastrous turning point for Germany and the Wehrmacht, as well as the military apparatus of the SS, which had sustained catastrophic losses of fighting age men and experienced soldiers. Following the launch and ultimate failure of multiple major offensives on the perilous Eastern Front, millions of German and Axis troops had been slaughtered, and millions more were wounded, captured, and interned as prisoners of war. Entire divisions were obliterated, their remnants often languishing inside harsh Soviet gulags and prisons. By this time, Germany simply lacked a sufficient pool of adult, experienced soldiers. Men were being hastily pulled from non-combat roles, including duties in the concentration camps, and urgently redeployed to the front lines. In this dire scenario, boys aged between 12 and 17 represented one of the few remaining groups physically capable of effectively handling a rifle and engaging in armed combat. Units like the notorious 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, which was primarily composed of 16 and 17-year-olds, were established. These young recruits were paired with seasoned, often fanatical, older SS soldiers who acted as mentors before being dispatched to the front lines. Teenagers were conspicuously involved in pivotal engagements, including the tenacious defense of Normandy in 1944 and the desperate Battle of Berlin in 1945. Hitler himself harbored a deep conviction that the younger population of the Reich possessed a more intense, unwavering fanaticism. He felt a distinct distrust toward older men who had experienced life before the advent of the Nazi Party, seeing them as potentially more prone to dissent or independent thought. For him, the young people, having been constantly surrounded by and indoctrinated into Nazi ideals, were more impressionable and thus less likely to surrender or question orders. He also believed they were physically stronger and, due to their profound brainwashing, often exhibited a distinct lack of fear. Furthermore, they were perceived as easier to control and command, and reports suggest that desertion rates may have been lower in units predominantly comprised of teenage soldiers. Hitler's chilling prophecy, "We will create a youth before whom the world will tremble," became a devastating reality by 1945, as teenagers and even younger children were transformed into the last, frail lines of defense against the complete destruction of the Nazi regime. Simultaneously, Nazi propaganda relentlessly framed the conflict as a final, existential struggle for survival. This narrative convinced many young people that they were fighting for their very future, and that life itself would be intolerable or impossible in the event of a German defeat. As Soviet forces closed in on Germany, the Ministry of Propaganda, led by Joseph Goebbels, broadcast harrowing messages asserting that a German loss would result in the mass destruction and annihilation of the entire German population, claiming the Soviets would engage in murder, torture, and enslavement. While these claims were heavily exaggerated for effect, they successfully instilled a massive degree of terror. Many Germans had either heard about or personally witnessed acts of retaliatory violence and revenge emanating from the Eastern Front. Young combatants were specifically told they were fighting to defend their immediate homes, families, and the nation itself, a burden that placed an unbearable psychological pressure on their young shoulders. In October 1944, the German government took the drastic step of creating the Volkssturm, People's Storm, a hastily organized, last-ditch militia born of sheer panic. It was a motley force composed of teenage boys, elderly men, and war veterans deemed unfit for regular military service. Some of these individuals were octogenarians, well into their 80s, while others were shockingly young. They were rushed into battle after receiving minimal, often perfunctory training. Visual records exist showing young boys being issued single-shot Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets, with their entire training consisting of rudimentary instructions. Here you go, aim, and the rocket comes out this way. They were deployed against the juggernaut of Soviet armor, including heavy tanks. Compounding their desperate situation, their weaponry was frequently outdated and defective, and there was a critical lack of ammunition in the final weeks of the war, rendering their resistance practically futile. Furthermore, these young fighters possessed little to no actual experience or understanding of genuine combat. Consequently, many Volkssturm units rapidly dissolved upon the appearance of Soviet forces or surrendered almost immediately. Despite the overwhelming odds, a core of these youth fought with fierce determination, particularly during the intense defense of Berlin. There are widely circulated, infamous photographs capturing Hitler himself, decorating young children, wearing German uniforms with medals and accolades for their actions in the besieged capital. For these children, however, a refusal to serve and fight for the defense of the Reich was an extremely perilous choice. Failure to take up arms could lead to the punishment of their families, who could be arrested, and the young person themselves could even face the firing squad. Refusal to fight was unequivocally considered treason. In Berlin, specifically, there were instances of deserters and those who refused to fight being hanged from lampposts and streetlights, with signs draped around their necks accusing them of cowardice and refusing to defend the women of Berlin. Local Nazi officials also frequently exerted immense pressure on parents. Crucially, it must be acknowledged that many of these boys did not choose to fight. They were brutally forced into service. A notable example is Alfred Zeck, who was only 12 years old when he was involuntarily swept into the fighting. He was, in fact, one of those who was voluntarily put forward for the war effort by his own family. He was subsequently decorated with the Iron Cross by Hitler in Berlin, a moment of profound propaganda value. Tragically, he was unaware that his own father had been killed in the fighting after also being pressed into the Volkssturm. Zeck was later dispatched far from his home to the territories of modern-day Czechia to continue fighting. Despite his age, he was eventually wounded, captured, and spent time as a prisoner of war. The grim consequence of utilizing child soldiers was nothing short of tragic. Thousands of teenagers, and even younger children still of primary school age, perished hopelessly in battles where their ultimate fate was doomed from the outset, and their operational goals were destined to fail. In the brutal confines of Berlin, children as young as 12 were sent into ferocious combat, armed with those single-shot anti-tank weapons, the Panzerfaust, and many of them died before they ever had the chance to fire that single round. The Soviet Red Army exhibited no hesitation in engaging and eliminating these child soldiers, and in the eyes of the battle-hardened Soviets, these youngsters were the products of a deeply hostile Nazi ideology and represented ultimately a very dangerous enemy that needed to be dealt with immediately and decisively. While some, after capture, were observed weeping and desperately pleading for their lives, within the chaos of Berlin, hundreds of these young children were killed in the savage house-to-house and street fighting against the Soviet troops. This conflict was not theirs. They had been tragically co-opted. Some met truly horrific ends, being vaporized by artillery fire or crushed by the steel treads of powerful T-34s or other heavy tanks. The ferocious close-quarters street fighting led to the reality that Soviet soldiers, hardened by years of unimaginable brutality, took virtually no prisoners, firing their rifles and submachine guns at any individual who posed a threat, even if they were just children. These Soviet troops were among the most battle-hardened fighters in the world. They were ruthless, and a soldier's age simply did not matter in the face of combat. One Soviet officer later chillingly recounted finding, in his own words, a boy of perhaps 13, still wearing short trousers, lying beside a smashed Panzerfaust. He was just a child. However, the tragedy was not confined to the Eastern Front. British soldiers also faced these child combatants, particularly during the grueling campaign across Western Europe following the Normandy landings. As the Allies pushed into Germany, they frequently encountered the fanatical resistance of young Hitler Youth members who had been placed into regular military units or were operating as part of the desperate Volkssturm. These boys were often the most fervent ideologues, fully convinced of their racial superiority and the need to fight to the last breath against the invading forces. The British Army was trained to neutralize all enemy threats, regardless of appearance. When a child soldier, no matter how young, raised a rifle, aimed a Panzerfaust, or prepared to throw a grenade, they were, by the rules of war, an immediate combatant and a lethal threat to the lives of the British troops. The split-second decisions made in the heat of battle left no room for philosophical debate on the moral culpability of the child. A soldier's primary duty is self-preservation and the protection of their comrades. Reports from the Western Front confirm the grim reality. Young German boys, often fighting with a terrifying fanaticism derived from their indoctrination, were shot and killed by British, American, and other Allied forces. The dark reason these German child POWs, though many were killed outright before being taken prisoner, were involved and often shot, lay in the deliberate, calculated policy of the Nazi regime. The decision to use children not as a last resort in the face of defeat, but as a systematic implementation of Hitler's long-standing belief in the fanatical purity of the young, guaranteed their tragic end. The regime knowingly put rifles in the hands of children, infused their minds with a deadly, unwavering ideology, and then deliberately placed them in positions where they were certain to encounter heavily armed, battle-tested enemies. For the children, surrendering was often considered a greater crime than death, due to the immense pressure and fear of reprisal against their families. For the enemy soldiers, including the British, the fanatical resistance and lethality of these child combatants left them with no choice but to neutralize the threat. The deployment of child soldiers throughout the final weeks of the Second World War was the final, desperate gamble of the Nazis. It was entirely predictable that these youngsters would face immediate death at the hands of the Soviet Red Army and the other Allied forces. Yet boom! The Nazi leadership was more than willing to shove teenagers and children into a conflict that could only end in their certain demise. This act perfectly encapsulates the regime's complete, sociopathic devotion to its survival, as even families were seen to willingly volunteer their own children to take up arms and march toward a grave, demonstrating the immense psychological grip of the ruling party. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And if you did enjoy this video, stay tuned for more.